Okay, so today, and Curry, I guess this is I suppose where it all started for me from an ITO perspective. I wouldn't be in this job now if it wasn't for you, I suppose. You give me a phone call while I was in the wilderness and say, hey, maybe you should come and do this job. So for the people who are listening and maybe watching on YouTube, you want to just explain who you are and where you're from?
Sure. I'm a railway tradesperson. I did my apprenticeship with the Australian National Railways back in, started 1978 through to 82, and spent a bit of time in that time frame just thinking about sort of skills and standards and whatnot. I had my first poor taste of skills standards at TAFE way back in those days, where I did a little job, took it in to get it marked, and was told that it was it was very earthy Shakespearean language back in those days, but at the end of the day it wasn't up to scratch. I got a very poor mark for it, actually, less than 50%, so being an angry young kid, wasn't all that happy about that, so I took it into the TAFE workshop and flung it across the room. Sort of didn't make the splash that I thought it would. Anyway, somebody picked it up, took it in and got double the mark that I got for it. And it sort of got me thinking about just how do we decide these things, So I wasn't I wasn't thinking about it in terms that I think about it today. So we've come a long distance, but it always stuck in my mind that little incident that shaped a lot of what I thought about, what's right, what's wrong, what's good, what's bad, what sort of consistency and standards around how we go about doing things. So that was a pretty pivotal thing for me. I became a union delegate while I was an apprentice, and I got to the point, I don't know, about 10 or 12 years into my time with the railways, where I was being dragged off the job by the union to go and fill in for someone or to run education programs and things like that, and I just sort of gravitated to it. And I'd done my time. I enjoyed the work. I loved the work. We travelled about the place building things, tearing things down, bridges and buildings and plant maintenance, and a huge variety of work. Got to try a whole pile of things, and learnt some pretty handy skills, and made some very good friends along the way. We had a very well organised workplace, and that's probably one of the reasons why I've ended up where I have. So I'm the union's national coordinator for skills training and apprenticeships. So I wrote a job description for myself about, 15 years ago, whatever it was, when I went to work for our national office. And essentially I described it as managing our engagement with the skills training and apprenticeship systems. And that involves policy, and making submissions around legislation, industrial disputes about classification and pay. It's a broad ranging remit that I have. And again, love the work. I get about the place a bit. Made some good friends, familiar pattern. So while I was a delegate at the railways, it was easy for the union to sort of call on me to take leave without pay to go and do something, solve something, add to something. And I ended up being asked to go and fill in for the official that looked after the railways for a month while he took leave. That was 32 years ago. I never went back. After about 6 years, the railways and I came to terms about the fact that I wasn't coming back. And I left there. I've been working for the AMWU in one form or another for all that time. That was a very exciting time to be involved in unions, have an interest in skills. 89 was just sort of getting to the sharp end of award restructuring, starting to put some detail into how the world of work was changing from a very regimented, task-oriented place into something that was a bit more open, something that was intended to be determined by standards, skill standards, proper training arrangements, proper consultation around training and skills and what skills meant. I sometimes describe my job was prosecuting the value of our members' skills. And I've always been interested in that. And it goes back to that flinging my little oxy welding test piece across the room and getting half the mark that someone else got. So, very interesting times, very dynamic. I rolled up right at the sharp end of that, and we were involved in a major project run by the Metal Trades Federation of Unions, jointly with the Metal Trade Industry Association. People would know them now as the Australian Industry Group. And we were tootling about the country trying to generate some understanding of not only what was being done in the award restructuring and structural efficiency space, but why it was being done, the importance of doing it, how incredibly important it was at a time when we had a significant balance of payments problem, we had crippling productivity issues. Everyone was arguing over whose fault it was. We didn't have the skills that we needed to create the industries that we needed to compete in a global scale. We were importing far more than we were exporting, and what we were exporting wasn't worth anywhere near as much as what we were importing. And I think it became clear to the warring tribes, the unions and the employers, that something had to give. And to their credit, the leadership of both of them sat down and tried to nut out a better way. And that ended up with a proposition that we needed to shift the way we valued work. We needed to provide a more nurturing environment for people to reach for higher levels of skill, more complex skills. For us to compete on a global stage, we needed to be doing the things that the high value economies were doing. We couldn't ride on the sheep's back. I do remember, if I might get the title of this right or wrong, I'm not sure, but we had a video that we used to run around showing people that was entitled Life After Debt. I mean, we had a balance of payments and a national debt that Edmund Hillary wouldn't have been able to climb over. And something had to give. We had to extract more out of what we did by way of value. So it was a very heady time.
What year was that about?
Well, that started in August 1989, and the second structural efficiency principle wage case decision, I think, was about then.
So that was on the back of the Hawke years, yeah?
Yeah, it was very much so. And if you were to measure Australia's labour productivity from that time, it showed sustained growth. And if it's permissible to enter into the political debate just a little bit, that came to a grinding halt with the election of the Howard government.
Yeah.
So we had some times where things changed. A lot of that was confidence. A lot of that was people lifting their gaze a little bit, reaching and aspiring to something a bit better. There were things happening. It was very dynamic. People had a bit of enthusiasm and optimism, because it wasn't just going to plough on the way it was. I mean, when you've got employers and unions who are just constantly battling for a bigger slice of a smaller pie, then it's going to be very difficult. If you can turn that around and build the pie and provide an objective measure, and that I think is probably the enduring benefit of the work that was done by my predecessors, both from the employers and the unions, who are very courageous to sit down and then go and try to tell the Australian Industrial Relations Commission that there was a better way of doing this, which they ultimately did. The Roger Bolans and whatnot, the Greg Harrisons, who sat down and tried to negotiate a very, very different way of doing
And now
business.
commissioners in the Australian Industrial Relations Commission, weren't they?
Roger Boland was, this is well before he went to the
Right.
commission, well before Greg Harrison went to the commission. So they were heading up the MTIA and the MTFU at the time. And there's a large group of people that were involved in that. So they were setting the framework around which some of the more transactional things happened. The notion of building award classifications structures that provide an incentive for workers to participate in skills formation.
Yeah.
That was one of the objectives of that structural efficiency principle. The elimination of unrealistic demarcations for work. I do remember the boilermaker that was given the ambitious task of teaching me my trade, shouting at me at one stage because I'd picked up a ring spanner, and back in those days I was allowed to use a shifting spanner, but oh no, you couldn't use a ring spanner, you had to be a fitter to use a ring spanner. And those sorts of demarcations were alive and well.
Can I just ask you about choosing your apprenticeship and maybe how your politics come about? You know, how did you choose your apprenticeship? How did you come to be in your trade?
Well, I was a northern suburbs of Adelaide boy, Elizabeth, which is a very socio-economically disadvantaged community these days. It was a more aspirational place back then. Elizabeth was built to service Holden's and WRE, the Weapons Research Establishment. It was to be the second city of South Australia after Adelaide, and it was built to house migrants from Europe, many of them from Britain. I'm from Northern Ireland myself. I came out here as a 6-year-old, and my father went to Woomera. We came out in 1966, went to Woomera, spent 3 years there. I watched the moon landing at the Woomera rocket range. At the time, my father was working on radar and guidance systems, and it was, you know, for a 6-year-old kid, it was just a sensational place. Coming out of a British winter into a Woomera summer in the middle of nowhere, that was a bit challenging.
So was your dad in defence, or?
He worked for the European Launch and Development Organisation. Right. He survived the Second World War. I think he ended up in North Africa, and he was given a posting to go and learn this new fandangle radar thing. So they went off and taught him how to do a bit of that towards the end of the Second World War. And from there he ended up in an aircraft factory and worked radar for the Berlin airlift when Berlin was the subject of a bit of an Eastern blockade. He was working radar for the airlift that serviced Berlin, and a very eclectic career he's had, and done some interesting things. But I wouldn't be here were it not for the fact that he survived the sinking of the Princess Victoria, which is the worst peacetime maritime disaster that the UK had suffered in the 1950s. And he was one of the last to get off a boat. They lost 144, I think.
Where was that?
Between Belfast and Stranraer in Scotland, where he met my mother. My mother's a Scot, my father's from, we were from not far from Belfast. So he hopped the ferry to go to work. That was his commute to work. And it got out into what was a significant storm. And because of a fault in, this is my understanding of the story, there was an apparent fault in the ferry doors at the back where they brought the cars in, and it got swamped from behind and sunk. And they sent out the lifeboats, but all of not one woman, not one child got off and survived. They were the first ones into the lifeboats, as was the tradition, and the lifeboats just smashed up against the sides of the boat, and there were about 40 or so got off, and they were the ones that tended to be the ones helping everyone into the lifeboats. And my father basically stepped off into the water and was picked up by a lifeboat. They had lifeboat stations all around the place. So he always, whenever he went back, he'd always go and put some money in the tin, because he wouldn't have been here. And I'm one of second youngest of 6, and none of us would have been born had he not got off that. So
it's amazing, some of these sliding door moments that unfortunately, unfortunately.
And you just don't know what might have been, or whatever. I mean, there's a whole pile of little anecdotes about that, some funny, others less so, but he survived. We came out here in the 60s, as I said. By 1969 we were at Elizabeth. The high school that I went to, I think, opened in 1967. It was closed in 1982. I mean, the whole of Elizabeth was built around migrants who generally brought families, and once the kids had grown up, they left, and there was just no population to keep it vibrant and dynamic. I mean, I still live within about 5 miles of Elizabeth, and a little market garden town. So, you know, my father ended up in an aircraft factory in the UK, and was a staunch trade unionist. My mother too. She worked in a plastics, rubber and cable making factory. Was a union delegate herself, and I guess apples don't fall far from the tree. So most of us have a reasonably strong sense of social justice, right and wrong, and what's, you know, proper and what's not, what's decent, what's not. So I always had this expression that I heard from my father about this. It's always the right time to do the right thing, and the right thing is always the right thing to do. There's never a right time to do the wrong thing.
It's a funny thing, you know, because my father was a Geordie, and he was obviously a northern England coal miner, and you know, although I didn't sort of get that in my formative years after I was 15, because he died when I was 14. But I think a lot of that sort of flowed on to me.
Yeah, I mean, you are a product of your environment.
Yeah.
You're a product of your heritage. They had I think my grandfather was a baker, and telling a story that's not mine, but my father had told me this story that there'd been a strike, and the bakers had gone on strike in Northern Ireland, and the strike was being undermined by people bringing in bread from England, and they were shipping the bread in, and a local shop was selling bread that was not produced by Northern Irish bakers who were on strike. So that wasn't a good thing at the time, and everyone was very angry. So anyway, decades later, my father's come out to Australia and taken my mother back, early 80s, and they're walking down the street at my hometown, and all of a sudden, without sort of warning, my father just turned 90 degrees, crossed the street, walked another 100 metres up the street and crossed back over again. And my mother's saying, "Oh, what was that? What was that about?" "Oh, see that shoe store back there? It used to be a bookstore, and it used to be this, and it used to be that. Well, about 40 years ago, it was a bakery, and they scabbed. And to that day, he couldn't walk past the shop."
Can you explain scabbing? Because this is one thing that I think the community, for one reason or another, doesn't quite get. They don't understand.
Well, I mean, it's a very ugly term, but it's a very ugly thing that it's reflecting as well. So, I mean, collectivism in unions is the key. I mean, we are always stronger when we share common values. We're always more powerful when we are focused on what we're trying to achieve. So the notion that a champion team will always beat a team of champions is an expression of collectivism. It's an expression of solidarity with the cause, that no one is bigger than the team, the collective. So this notion that you join a union to even up the balance in the power relationship between labour and capital. So when the collective decides that here's how we're going to go about this, what right does someone have to deliberately set out to undermine that? And the sort of the way that the union movement has tended to respond is to not treat them all that kindly. So there is, a lot of language around to people who undermine the legitimate efforts of others, and that strike went on for 5 or 6 months, and it was being undermined by people. It wasn't just one person, but that was one example of his persistence, and I may have picked up a bit of that along the way, I suspect.
Yeah, look, my career before I ended up being a member of this union and being an official eventually, and a delegate and an official, I was in the Defence Force, and I've been listening to a lot of people about, return services and that lately. And it's something the penny didn't drop for a long time until recently, and it's about people, when they're in conflict, don't fight for their flag or their country or their Prime Minister or President, whatever. They fight for their mates. And they'll jump on a grenade for their mates. And really,
they fight for their comrades.
Yeah. And that's where I think there's a strong affiliation with the union movement. Ideally, if you are in a collective and you will stand by the man next to you, and if they actually become a traitor against you and do something against the cause that's going to possibly hurt the whole movement, then that's what ends up ostracising them.
It can do.
Yeah.
I mean, the point here is to try and build a shared sense of value.
Yeah.
And I think working men and women very clearly have interests that are different from those who employ them.
Yeah.
That doesn't mean that you cannot find a way of satisfying both sets of interests.
Yeah.
But we are not all in the same boat. In a sense, we are looking to satisfy different interests. But the whole notion, just to go back to that award restructuring, that period in the 80s and early 90s, was about finding a vehicle to deliver for both sets of interests. So we're not in the same boat. Employers operate for profit in the main. Their interests are building capital and whatnot. Workers can't work without employers. Employers can't employ without people to employ. So there's a balance, and it's a matter of whether that balance is reasonable or whether it's skewed. And we would say at the moment that balance is well skewed. The share of the economy that's going to profits is orders of magnitude higher than the share that's going to wages. We are having now a very different debate about the economy than we were having 4 or 5 years ago, and that whole sort of debt and deficit rhetoric has changed. Debt is no longer the worst of all evils. It's sometimes a necessary thing to deliver for the common good. We are not a good country if we are excluding people from opportunities in the economy. So I think we've got to concentrate less on what divides us in that sense, and start to think about the sorts of things that we can employ to build more common and shared interests. And workers, whether they're in unions or not, share many interests. And I think that things like fairness, I think notions of gender equality, I think notions of diversity, there are many, many things that working people, if they were to be able to break free from the pressures of daily life and their economic circumstances, if they were able to take the time to take a breath and sit with others, they could explore the extent of some of that. But we're not able to do a lot of that. You know, the fast pace of life is separating people. Facebook is no substitute for sitting down and chewing the fat, a bit like we are now. I mean, you couldn't do that in a media release. You couldn't do it in a tweet. So it's very difficult to get at those shared and common interests unless you take the time to do that. And I think what you're doing is a way of providing an opportunity for people to test their views, compare them with mine, for me to compare them with others. And I think it is in the exploration of those, maybe on the face of it, different views, but they probably share many common themes. So I just think that we can get a bit worked up about some things. You don't see as many strikes, but that doesn't mean that people are more satisfied with their working life today. It may just be a reflection that the rules don't facilitate people withdrawing their labour. We need balance. We've always needed balance. The best times that we have, like the 80s and 90s, were the times when we stopped fighting about who was going to win and trying to build a platform where everyone could get enough of what they wanted out of the system to keep them satisfied. I had part of the education program that the AMWU ran back in the early to mid 80s sometimes involved, I've been in the Industrial Commission, the Fair Work Commission this morning, giving evidence in a matter, and we were training delegates in those things, advocacy and how the commission works. And we had a person that used to work for us that ended up in the commission. And we got them to do some role play type things where we would go in and as delegates we would run a case. And myself and a mate of mine, we were the union on the side of the case, and the state secretary of the union was playing the employer, which was a very formidable thing. I'm glad he was on our side ultimately. And the commissioner was playing the commission. And we went through, prepared our case, got our witnesses, did all of that, and then we went in and presented all of this, the case, our case, and the commission made its decision. And out we went, hopped in the lift, and the commissioner had said to us, well, how do you think that went? And my mate said, he said, I thought that was just terrific, you know. He said, well, I've got one question. What's that? He said, who won? The commission's job is not to decide winners and losers, and he did explain that the commission works best when you keep everyone in the room talking. So it's not about, if someone wins all the time, the other side stops playing and they find another way of getting their point across. And the commission was about the settlement and prevention of industrial disputes, you know. So this notion of trying to moderate an alternative view, conciliation rather than arbitration and whatnot. We still need rules that provide for right from wrong to be differentiated. But you know, we have skewed even that. The commission now is a much more difficult environment for trade unions because the rules they apply the law of the day, and the culture of trying to find a balance is less pronounced, I think, these days. So I just think that we have some experience of doing it well as a country. We have some experience of doing it poorly.
I think generally the community at this point in time, whether we talk about Australia or the US or other countries, and particularly in social media, about this view of trying to silence people that you don't agree with, is a bit of a dangerous one, because I think that's exactly what happens, is that people will find other means. It goes underground, and you know, the thought processes don't disappear, or the actions don't disappear, they just become more subversive.
Well, I mean, I may have a slightly different view. It's not about cancelling, cancel culture, as they seem to describe it as. For me, your right to free speech is no different to mine, and you say something that I find offensive or objectionable, then I'm probably likely to call you out for it. And people then get offended. You say something that offends me, I say something that offends you, and all of a sudden I'm in the wrong for that, but you're not. You know? So I think there are limits to, there is no right to free speech that is unfettered. I think we sometimes are a bit more aggressive when you're sitting behind a keyboard and you're not in the room. It's sometimes easy to let loose a bit more than you would if you had to actually confront somebody with your views. But there's some awful things that people say and do. You've
experienced some of that as well.
Yeah.
You know, where in the room people will say nothing, and then all of a sudden you'll find that people are, you know, venturing out and saying things to other people and verbaling you. Well, I mean,
I think being in the room is a better way of dealing with things, for sure, no doubt about that. But you know, I'm not a free speech and into the trenches to defend my right to abuse people. That's, you know, we have civil norms that we should respect, and in part sometimes you get the behaviour that you breed. I was just saying to someone the other day that employers get the unions they deserve. You know, if every employer was an angel doing exactly the right thing, unions wouldn't exist.
Well, I've always said that.
Yeah. So I'd prefer to sort of concentrate more on the constructive things that we need to be doing, rather than this die in a ditch thing to defend some, you know, Americanised notion of liberty, justice, and the pursuit of whatever it was. You know, I just think we're getting a bit carried away with some of that stuff.
I think bloody-mindedness doesn't have a place wherever you are. You know, you've got to be educated and constructive about what you're trying to communicate.
Yeah, I mean, I often say to people, I'm a Boilermaker. I've got an opinion about everything, and I do. You know, you ask me an opinion about something, I'll tell you whether I claim to have well, I wouldn't claim to have expertise in it necessarily, but I might say, well, my opinion of that is this.
Yeah. And I was saying to someone the other day that having an opinion doesn't make you right either.
No, absolutely, but it's the comparison of opinions.
That's
It's
right.
the interchange of opinions that allows you to draw some sort of conclusion about, your own views.
Yeah.
So unless my views are tested, they will remain my view.
That's right.
So that sort of notion, my father always said, and I quote him quite a lot, but he said, if I can't convince you that I'm right, it's possible I'm the one that's wrong.
Yeah.
So everyone that you talk to, everyone you interact with has some sort of influence over you. They either confirm your view, they alter your view, they change your view completely,
I think
So everyone subtly influences everyone else.
Yeah.
I hope.
I think a lot of people unfortunately get in echo chambers these days, and they only want to listen to those that they agree with.
That's right.
Rather than challenge their thought processes and try and move on from where they are. I remember someone once saying, that this happens in politics a lot, where people are being told that they flip-flop because they change their minds.
Yeah.
Well, maybe they've had more information, and that's why they change their minds.
Well, I suppose there's it's a not so subtle difference from being a person who is capable of having their mind changed and being a hypocrite.
Yeah.
Not every mind change is done on the basis of that people being convinced. So debt and deficit, have we been convinced that debt is good? We've got plenty of it. I don't know that it is much better now to have 5 and 6 times the amount of debt that we had not all that long ago. The question is, was it necessary? Now, I, in the main, think that debt applied well is a necessary part of economic and social stability, and different governments have different views about that. So sometimes you can call it hypocrisy, or you can call it you had a conversion on the road to Damascus.
Yeah, it depends on whose side of that equation you're on, I suppose, as to whether you think it's good or not.
Well, Greta Thunberg, I think I saw something on Facebook, so who knows whether it's true or not, but the quote resonated with me when she said to someone, you better be very careful, it will be us that write your history. And I'm just thinking, there's a lot of people criticising a young woman for having a point of view and demanding a right to criticise her point of view under the banner of free speech. And that's all she's doing. That's all she's doing. I don't know if she's right or wrong about that stuff, but more of what she says resonates with me than some of the more conservative amongst our politicians who abuse her for having a point of view and having the courage to go out and prosecute that point of view. I think she's fantastic, even if I disagreed with her. Having the courage to go out and do those things, I think is great. But the next generation will write our history. They will pass judgment on us. Winners write history, or future generations write history. So,
or they try and erase it.
Well, a friend of ours, Paul, on the same committee as you, he has a thing on the footer of his email signature. It's a Nishki quote, and I'm not sure I'll get it right. But there was this notion that the truth is essentially a function of power. So winners write history, and we get to tell that truth. So you can interpret history in different ways, but those who write history write it from a position of power. It's getting all a bit philosophical.
I just have one more quote that I remember from our interactions with another person who'd crossed our paths about the world is run by those who turn up.
The future will be decided by those who turn up.
Right.
A delegate from our Ford plant down in Geelong, and I mean it is as true today as it was when he said that in about 2006, I think. Always stuck with me. I quote it regularly, and in a sense that has become the role that we all play. We either want to participate in the future and be around the table when decisions are made about the future, or we want to go along. My view is that we should, if we've got a point of view, you should express it. You should be expressing it somewhere where it will make a difference.
Unfortunately, too many express their views in a cupboard or in a place that it doesn't matter.
And politics is always best at its best when people are participating in it.
Yeah, I'll come back to that in a second. We didn't get to the point where you became an apprentice. What made you choose to be a boilermaker?
It probably chose me more than anything. I always find it a bit strange that, oh, what are you on boilermaker? Oh, you make boilers? No. I was, I had things that I thought I was reasonably good at school and things that I despised when I was at school. I mean, odd things like physics I thoroughly enjoyed. English was a subject that I always enjoyed, and chemistry, take it or leave it. I think I took 16 or 17 minutes to finish my chemistry exam in my last year. It was multiple choice, so that was pretty easy, just and out the door. I wasn't remotely interested in that. I was in a generation that didn't routinely go to university. I didn't consider myself to be a dunce. I didn't see a trade as a second prize or anything like that. I had some really good teachers, some sensational teachers who always have, high school teachers particularly, have that sort of balance of inspiring kids, giving them structure, giving them some sense of independence that they can in fact alter their future. And that school was 1,500 kids, I think, in my last couple of years. They announced they were going to hold a reunion of people at the school, and somebody said they might get 100 people turn up to this reunion. I thought, well, I don't know if you can find 100 people. Very small small time frame within which the school was open. And they booked a place that I occasionally have a shandy in, an RSL not far from the school, to hold this reunion. And a mate of mine had said, oh, they've booked the room and said they'll get 120 people. I said, oh, I think that's probably going to be a struggle. They stopped counting at 550 that turned up. The licence didn't go that far for the establishment, but that's another matter. And they had 3 reunions, all well attended and extraordinary. There's 1,500 or 1,600 people in a Facebook group. And I couldn't believe it. I mean, these, they're all successful in their own way. They have problems like everybody else. So it was an interesting environment. But my father was he would describe himself probably as an electrician. He was an electronics tradesman at the end, working for telecom. He was away from home probably 6 months of the year. I'm not far off that in my job. My mother brought up 6 kids in a 3-bedroom house. I mean, just think about those things. That wouldn't happen today. It's extraordinary. So I was interested, and back in those days, the 2 biggest employers of apprentices outside the Power Authority, which is mostly around Port Augusta and the power station up there, but Telstra, Telecom, and the railways both took on 50, 60 apprentices every year. And it wasn't a question of you going and applying for an apprenticeship as a boilermaker. You went and sat an aptitude test, and they would subtly sort of shift your focus into an area that they thought your aptitude was right for. So I, along with 1,500 of my closest friends, sat an aptitude test for 60 apprenticeships with, I think, Telstra, and 45 or 50 apprenticeships with the railways. And I got through, and we had a chat, and I ended up being funneled into the sort of fabrication trade area. So at the end of the day, I'm not sure that people those days had a really clear understanding of what it meant, but they knew the value of having a set of skills that they could trade on. And as I say, I mean, my job today is to prosecute the value of our members' skills. I mean, without them, there would be none of what we see around us. Yeah. Our ability to manufacture, our ability to build naval shipping, submarines, frigates, all of those things, our ability to engage with advanced manufacturing, Industry 4.0, renewable energy. Kay Schofield, who would be known to many in the the vocational education and training space had this great line that skills are not the answer, but there is no answer without skills. And I'm a passionate believer in that. We all have skills. I was just telling somebody off the other day about using the term, it might have been you, semi-skilled. You know, and I don't accept that language. I don't like it. I don't accept it. Employers would never admit to hiring people who had no skills. Probably would like to pay them as if they had no skills. But the reality is that everyone, the old-fashioned expression was that labourers are worthy of their hire.
Yeah, I think the term that I should have used would probably be non-trade. So that's more, and I fully agree with what you're saying. You know, there's skills at every level. So
well, I mean, we've been to places together. We were at one yesterday where non-trade people have significant skills. So it's a matter of how we codify or articulate those skills and their value, and that's why I'm so proud of the work that we've done as a union. Not me particularly, but I love the work of determining skill standards. I love the notion of an occupational standard to give people certainty that I do this work. It requires these skills, this knowledge, and that skill and knowledge has a value. And I can prosecute the value of that because I have the tools to do it. Now, of course, you know, the way the training system responds to those standards has been problematic in the last decade or so. But the notion of letting industry set a standard for jobs and occupations, building a high quality training system, TAFE at the centre, and that's our view. They're the only one that is big enough and coherent enough to shift the way we do this. But having a high quality training system that can deliver people who can meet those occupational standards gives us a good chance to confront the future with some optimism or confidence to get us to reach. I remember one of our former colleagues, who's now off in the industry superannuation space, going out to an auto components place to do skills recognition for an auto components mob that was going out the door because of the closure of our automotive manufacturing, and wandering around trying to describe the work and the skills and knowledge of those workers, and finally arriving at a profile of each of those jobs. And the employer, who was uncomfortable about that all going on, eventually came to the point of view that he knew much more about the capability of his workforce after that than he did before it. And that enabled him to go out and pursue work outside the automotive sector because, you know, they've predominantly been an auto component shop. I mean, they were just making engineering components. They weren't building cars. They were building bits that were bolted onto cars or whatever. So we need to shift our thinking about capability in the country, but it should revolve around an industry-determined standard. And we need to separate out our regulation of training from the regulation of setting occupational standards. And, you know, dare I say it, a national framework curriculum at an industry level would help us to do that. We apply all of the funding and regulation requirements onto an industry standard that is not the right vehicle for those things. We don't know the true cost of training by looking at a training package. That doesn't describe what it takes to train someone. And vocational education and training is a worthy vocation in its own right, and we need professional, highly qualified teachers who are able to train people, whatever their background, to meet the standard. I do get a little antsy sometimes when, you know, can't find suitable candidates for an apprenticeship. And I think, well, does that mean you've got to turn up with all of the skills the apprenticeship is supposed to give you before you start? Or does that mean that we lack the ability to train people from scratch? Because you're not always able to pick and choose who you can have and who you can't have. And unless we are investing more heavily in primary and secondary education, and certainly more heavily in vocational education and higher education, these problems get worse, not better. Can't sit back and say, bring us work-ready people. So as a community, we've got to understand that that's an investment in our future that we need to make. Otherwise, the aspirations that we have as a country will fall.
Yeah, well, I find it interesting because I noticed, and I'm looking at going into this conference with ITECA for no other reason that they're talking about accelerated apprenticeships again and saying that this is what employers are wanting. And someone said to me once that industry is looking for what they call 20 years of experience in a 20-year-old for $20,000, which you might as well be talking about Jolly Green Dragons. They don't exist.
I'm not sure that there's empirical evidence that Jolly Green Giants don't exist. I think there's probably a reasonable perception that they don't, but there's more chance of them existing than the other.
That's right.
Yeah.
But I think there's been a big drive, and we're seeing it now around the AIS in New South Wales, talking about bringing together vet and university training in one space. There's quite a few other projects on foot where people are trying to look at ways to draw more people into the training system, not for industrial outcomes and jobs that exist, but just to make money out of training. So skills aren't being developed, and those skills aren't being put to good use. And I think you've talked to me a number of times about the Naval Shipbuilding College and shipbuilding generally. We know that the trades involved in building ships is the foundation trade is fabrication, and you don't need to know the structure of a ship to build the components and put them components together.
Well, there'll probably be 1,500 to 2,000 component suppliers and other supply chain partners that will be involved that may be very interested in shipbuilding, I don't know, but they're not in the shipbuilding business.
That's right.
So no one builds a ship is my line. We had a debate about, should our occupational standards make specific reference to shipbuilding? What purpose a fabricated component ends up serving is of less interest to the person who is fabricating it than what the specifications say. It needs to be this long, this tall, this wide, and it has to be welded here, there, wherever. And at the end of the day, that's what they're interested in. They don't get a drawing of a ship. They get a drawing of the component that they are engaged in making. Someone has to have the overall planning and technical knowledge to bring all of that together. But we shouldn't assume that everyone who's involved in naval shipbuilding will be a naval shipbuilder. Without getting more too specific about what some of those calls have been, for inclusion of more shipbuilding specific content, we need the right content. We need to listen to all of the voices that are involved in that. But should it be training providers deciding what a boilermaker looks like? I think the industry should decide what a boilermaker looks like, what the skills are, rather than what sector of the industry they might be in, unless that sector makes an actual difference to the standard. So we need to be able to walk and chew gum, and we keep putting in place structures that are not good at that. And our current structure is hidebound by rules that are more bureaucratic than they are practical. And you're not allowed to say this and you're not allowed to do that, and everything's template driven because we don't want a one-size-fits-all approach, but we've got a one-size-fits-all approach, if you know what I mean. So I just think we need to think a bit more laterally about letting industry decide some things. We call ourselves a country. Some might argue that occasionally we're a federation of warring tribes. And the jurisdictional stuff, people who know me know my views about the hidebound bureaucracy that we have. It's not helping. When states talk about our industry, those industries don't belong to state government departments. That industry is an organic creature of itself, in itself, and I don't know too many places that would say I'm a South Australian manufacturer, I'm a Tasmanian manufacturer, they're a manufacturer. They could equally be doing this stuff anyway. The jobs are not different because of which city or state you're in. We just got to get a little bit more practical, and the constitutional issues associated with federation play out very badly in this space, and we've got to do something about them. That's an absolute must if we're going to deliver on the aspirations that we're promising people.
So I might ask you, and this is, I guess, the hot topic of the time, and I know recently you've stepped down from the chair of the Industry Reference Committee for the Metals Training and
I
Manufacturing.
think I've probably more realistically collapsed out of the chair. I know we've had a collaborative approach in the main about the design elements of training packages between employers and unions for the best part of 40 years. We've always had a keen interest, probably a shared interest, in getting that bit right. We use the training package and the training system to develop the skills that our members then rent out. They don't sell their labour, they rent it out. And employers profit from the deployment of those skills. Our training system, I would say, it seems obvious to me, it's not delivering the skilled workers our economy needs. Not known for quoting the Productivity Commission very often, but I've been following one of their stats that they include in the report on government services that they do annually. And something of the order of 85% of people engage in the VET system for employment-related purposes. Sadly, less than 1 in 5 end up in a high skilled job, and I can't get my head around why that would be. So the harder we train, the worse the return is, and something is very badly wrong. Now, we think that there's a public good created by a vocational education and training system that is producing skilled workers who go on to employment in the economy, hopefully in an area related to what they trained in. So I'm very tired of sort of seeing people say, "I'll come and do this course. What job will it qualify me for?" So I get a qualification. What does it qualify me for? Oh, pretty much anything. It kind of can't be right. So we get a lot of these pathways, often lower levels, Certificate 1, Certificate 2, accredited courses, and everyone's claiming that they're the be-all and end-all because they will prepare people for employment generally. Well, occupational standards are not about employment generally. They're occupational standards. They are to define the skills and knowledge and the application of that skills and knowledge to the standard required in the workplace, and that means in a job. So I think we need to stick to our knitting. We need to more tightly focus on the core purpose of what IRCs and the occupational standards, training package, competency standards world is about, and that's producing the skilled workers who go on to employment in an area related to their training. Set a standard, build a training system that can train people to meet that standard. Not just train people, but train them to meet that standard and then deploy them in the economy. A skilled and adaptable workforce effectively deploying its skills in the economy is a public good that is worthy of public investment. If we're putting $7 billion into a vocational education and training system every year of public money, and it is failing to produce the skilled workers, as it is, because only 18% of people who complete go into a high skilled job, what are we training for? Aren't we training them to have higher skills, to meet the requirements and end up in a better skilled job, a better skill, better paid? One of the 1989 structural efficiency principle was about more varied, fulfilling and better paid work. That was the payoff to workers who were prepared to relax to the stage where you could use a ring spanner and not a shifting spanner. Those unrealistic demarcation. So the demarcation was based on whether you had the skills to do it and whether you were being appropriately paid for that. So I think we've just got to have a bigger conversation, but there's nowhere to have it. You know, you and I sit here, people might look at this, listen to it and agree or disagree, but they can't engage in the debate that way. And we need somewhere, whether it's an AUPA, Skills Australia, National Training Board, whatever it happens to be, where employers, unions and others with an interest in the sector can sit down and try and work out, not my ideas are better than your ideas, not we should win the argument because we occupy this space in the system, or you should listen to me over them because I occupy that space. We should be bigger than that, and we should be trying to provide an opportunity for people to not argue about why they're right, but to tease out and do the hard yards of working out what is the best direction to go, and an area where we don't let the perfect get in the way of the perfectly good. I think we lack a sense of purpose in our training system. I've said it for a long time. We are trying to make the system serve too many masters. We have introduced an unfettered competition into the system that is regulated by a standard that cannot regulate it. If we find someone doing the wrong thing, it's after they've done it. And we just keep ramping up the volume of the regulation without ramping up the effectiveness of that regulation. Regulating the wrong thing in the wrong way. It's a classic Marxist politics. Groucho Marx, Karl Marx. Groucho's line on politics is looking for problems, finding them everywhere, diagnosing them incorrectly and applying the wrong remedy. And I think that's where we're at. We see training policy as being an economic policy rather than being a social and economic policy that has a purpose. And I think the purpose, first and foremost, should be the production of skilled workers that go on to employment in the economy in an area that is related to their training. Now that's a pretty simple concept. Need a boilermaker, train this person, they meet the standard for a boilermaker, and on you go. We can build stuff around that. There's a lot of work that has to be done around generalist vocational education. We're failing at that. And we're failing, I think, because we're using the wrong product to deliver it. So we're now trying to reshape training packages designed to produce a boilermaker into a training program that's designed to rebuild people's vocational skills and literacy and numeracy, their levels of civic understanding, all of those things that we used to get through a combination of schools and other things. So we would go and do a pre-apprenticeship program. You go off and do some integrated literacy numeracy. I started my apprenticeship. I spent 6 months in the apprentice school, not learning how to weld or form and shape steel, but learning how to communicate in the world of work with other people, other workers, learning the language of railways, learning the context of the work I would be done. And from day one, no matter who we were, all ended up in the same place, learning the same things as fitters, electricians, boilermakers, plumbers, whatever, learning how Westinghouse air brakes work on it. I never worked on them, never. But I know how they work. I know how they work in broad terms. Couldn't fix one, but all about context. What is the economic value of having a railway system and things like that, and build a sense of pride in what you were doing. And we were always described as engineers. We were in engineering trades, and we were treated well in terms of being part of the future of the industry. And there was an encouragement to think of it as a longer term career. But all of the little gaps that might exist in terms of literacy and numeracy and your ability to communicate, your ability to collaborate with other people, knowing your sense of place in the world, all of that was ironed out along the way almost subliminally. You know, you were given training that was about papering over some of the cracks and filling some of the gaps in whatever you brought with you. Some people needed it more than others.
It sounded like the recruitment process of how you got into that apprenticeship made a bit of a difference. And then once you got in there, they actually built on that, profile that you already had with you.
And they were setting a standard for someone who could enter their apprenticeship running, hit the ground running. They could start to learn the specific skills they needed to succeed at their trade. And the process, as you say, and this is a great weakness, we almost outsource the process of selecting apprentices to a third party.
Well, even the conversation we had the other day at the company where we had a site visit in the ITAB meeting, they said they sort of were very lackadaisical about the way they recruit. They use contract labour to start with, and then they might bring someone in, but the foundation really isn't there. And now they're trying to paper those cracks over by looking at internally recognising skills, which there's a policy gap, I think, currently in the New South Wales policy.
Not just in New South Wales.
Across the
this
board.
is a real weakness.
Yeah.
That skills recognition, knowing what the starting point is, and this was again part of the Railways apprentice school 6-month period, was about working out where you were starting from.
Yeah.
I mean, you've done your aptitude test, you've done all of these interviews, and a series of filters that were there to try and work out, and it wasn't always the smartest ones that got through. It was the ones that they deemed to be in the right place to learn. So they just had to know what that starting point was.
Yeah.
So you might be starting here, someone else might be starting there, but where they wanted you to end up was at the same time both being here.
Yeah.
So that they had a plan.
Yeah.
They knew what type of person they were looking for. Wasn't always the smartest. You had to be smart enough, you had to be good enough. You didn't have to be the best.
Yeah.
And I think every workplace is the same. Putting some effort into selecting, understanding, knowing the starting point, and then building a plan. I mean, we have generic training plans for radically different people. I don't know whether it was a judgment about me or not, but I was the last apprentice for about 3 years where I was, and they put on 2 in that workplace. The Railways took on quite a number, but 2 of them ended up in the same workshop as I did. And they walked in the door on day 1. They'd done their 6 months in the apprentice school. And 2 very different people. You've got the 16-year-old, country town. Dad ran a motor mechanic workshop, agricultural equipment and cars and trucks and tractors and all of that. The second one was a person who'd completed year 12, was 18, walked into the workshop, and you could just see the 16-year-old just sort of relaxing into, this is a workplace, I know what this is about. And the other one was horrified, absolutely horrified. He'd been an apprentice for 6 months. And it was a stinking hot day. It's a boiler making and diesel shop where they're working on heavy diesel, fixing mobile plant stuff. Switch tampers, ballast regulators, all sorts of stuff. The smell of diesel fumes in the air and welding fumes and all of that, he fainted. With all of the things that the Railways had put in place, he still wasn't prepared for it. Now, I always thought the railway selection process was pretty good. I mean, I would say that. They did choose me at the end of the day. They might have a different view about that now, but that choice is really important. And being able to choose a person that you have confidence that you can get them there. Now, I always say that back in those days, you had to die or go to jail to get out of an apprenticeship. And if you went to jail, it had to be for a fair while. Otherwise, they'd wait,
I think your career in the union sort of demonstration of that, isn't it?
Well,
because you were employed by them for quite a while before you became a full-time official.
Yeah. I was nominally employed by them for a while. I was on leave without pay for about 6 years. But I mean, in my own defence, I mean, the work that we were doing was valuable to them as well. They benefited from, and even before award restructuring had sort of worked its way into the norm of industrial relations, we were engaged in that on the job at the Railways, of trying to find ways of cementing our productivity, our competitiveness. There's always the threat of privatisation, which eventually, of course, occurred. One of the great the things that disturbs me most about those times is I drive past what used to be my workplace. My kids could probably drive over a railway bridge. I'll say, Dad made that, or Dad did this, or because I would do it wherever I went. But I can't do that there because it's a Bunnings now, and that hurts a bit. That should still be an engineering workplace that is pumping out high quality gear. And I think that's we don't value that enough because we have not yet attached a value to the capability. And if we're going to grow as a country in that sort of high value end, we need to value what we do much more. And good work ain't cheap, cheap work ain't good. There's a was the truth about that, and skills are central to all of that. And I'm determined to keep at it. I keep saying to people, how long you worked for the union? About 32 years. I've got to keep doing it till I do it right, till I get it right. So we're going to keep having a crack at that. It's worthy work. It's honourable work, and I've got counterparts in other organisations who hold to similar views that this is work that is worthwhile doing. It would be nice if we were given a bit of elbow room to do it the way we want to do it, for industry to be in charge, because we were talking earlier, we are better when we're in the room together trying to work through these issues than we are in our respective trenches throwing hand grenades and policy pronouncements and media releases and everything that goes along with that. There's a lot of grief that goes on in workplaces, but there's a lot of good work that goes on as well. So it's not all bad news. We sometimes have to lift our gaze a little bit and see over the top of that and get a glimpse of what the future might be, rather than what it looks like today. Because what it looks like today is not ideal.
Yeah. Well, on that note, I think we're just over an hour now in our conversation, and usually it doesn't seem like an hour, and I don't think it seems like an hour at all. No, and I think we can go on, and we will come back and have more conversations. As long as you're in this role, and I know you, I'm going to keep knocking on your door and saying, sure, please give me some time. I'm sure the people who are going to listen or watch this will be very appreciative of listening to your views and understanding better your background, where you came from and where you're going. And, like I've said to, Fraser in the past and to David Tiller, I'm keen to have a collective one of these with you guys.
Well, I'm certainly up for that. I mean, we share very similar views about the importance of the work. There's always a bit of toing and froing about how you might get where you want to go. But they're conversations that need to be had, and people need to have a better understanding. The Release 2 stuff that we did with the MEM training package, a lot of that's not well understood. What we did, why we did it, and I think if people better understood some of that, they might be a bit more relaxed about some of their views about what we've done. And I think that's a conversation that still needs to be ventilated a bit more.
I think we'll do that one. I want to do one on classifications and reclassification work that happens in the workplace.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Obviously the point system, how that operates, because that's quite maligned and misunderstood across the place. Talk about hours of delivery and the impact of reduction of face-to-face delivery and things like that. So there's plenty of topics and things that we can talk about. So I thank you for today. I know you've got to catch a plane and I've got another meeting to be in, but I appreciate your time and us having this conversation.
No, it's been great. Thank you.
Cheers, mate.